Welcome to The Writing Life, the podcast for anyone who writes. I'm Steph, your host, and I'm coming to you from the National Centre for Writing, based in Norwich, the city of stories. So my co-host Holly isn't with me this week. I am flying solo, although I do have my puppy Rowdy to keep me company. He also likes books, but mostly because he's a fan of eating paper. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce this episode of the podcast because it features two fantastic people. The first is award-winning author Jon McGregor, who is one of my favourite writers working today. And the second is NCW Chief Executive Peggy Hughes. And they came together recently to discuss researching for fiction. In case you're not familiar with Jon, he is an award-winning novelist and short story writer. He's been nominated for the Booker Prize for 3 of his novels, including his 2002 debut, If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, which also went on to win the Betty Trask Prize and the Somerset Maugham Award. His third novel, Even the Dogs, earned McGregor the International Dublin Literary Award, whilst his 2017 work Reservoir 13 scooped up the Costa Book Award. His latest book, Lean Full Stand, was Waterstones Fiction Book of the Month. Jon recently visited us in Norwich to stay in our writer and translator cottage, and he appeared on stage at the City of Literature weekend at Norfolk and Norwich Festival. He's also one of our patrons. So he and Peggy had a chat about his book Lean Full Stand, which was inspired by his travels to Antarctica in 2004. During the discussion, they touched on the challenge of writing complicated characters and storylines, how to turn real-world experiences into fiction, and the importance of risk-taking in writing. So without further ado, I will hand over to the esteemed Peggy and Jon McGregor.
Jon, thank you so much for joining us again to talk about your beautiful book, Lean Full Stand. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks. I'm a little bit damp, but otherwise well.
Ooh, is it not been nice where you are?
No. I don't think it's been nice all year, has it? But it's okay.
It's terrible.
The garden's looking lovely for it. So.
Yeah, this is true. Here today is actually sunny, which we can't believe. Wow. We're kind of wondering what the big yellow thing in the sky is, but yeah. Anyway. Well, I am joining you today from the cottage on the campus at NCW, which I think I'm right in saying is where you wrote at least a bit or finished Lean Full Stand. Is that right?
That is true. Yeah, back in the summer of 2020. That very strange
Wow.
Summer of 2020. I stayed in the cottage for a week, and yeah, I was finishing off final edits the novel before kind of daring to send it in to my editor.
No one wants to revisit 2020 really, but can you sort of take us back there to what shape of a thing were you toting to Norwich with you to try and work on in the cottage? What stage? I guess it sounds like it was quite final, but what were you working with?
I was at the point where I was repeatedly printing out versions of manuscripts, which is kind of always a fun place to be. I do enjoy that kind of that rewriting process, that kind of getting everything out on the table and looking at how it's working as a complete piece of work, and having a nice long table to work at and having each chapter kind of separately and kind of moving backwards and forwards and I don't know, kind of kidding yourself that you're somehow making something rather than just thinking about things. So it was fairly well advanced. There were things that were not quite hanging together. I knew there was some new bits of writing I needed to do to make it all hang together properly. Yeah, that strange stage.
Yeah, interesting. Before we go further, there is a lot I want to ask you about the sort of the machinery that sits behind the writing of a novel, this novel. But I think first, because some people may not have had the pleasure of reading Lean Full Stand, could you give us the world that we're in?
It's a book about 3 men. Ultimately, it's a book about 1 man and his wife, but it begins being about 3 men who are in Antarctica. They're in a remote field research station, which is a fancy name for a shed. They're in a big shed in Antarctica, and they've been there for several weeks working together. The main guy, Doc, is much older than the other 2 and has been working in Antarctica every year for 30 odd years. The other 2, it's their first time there. They're much younger. And when the book begins, the 3 of them are caught up in a storm and they've made some fairly key blunders, which means that things are going horribly wrong. And that horribly wrongness is about the first third of the book. And then things change and we come back to England, back to Cambridge, and the main character, Doc, has had a stroke and has lost his language, and the rest of the book is about how he and his wife deal with that loss of language, the recovery of some of that language, the complete change in their circumstances and their relationship, and the whole kind of new world that they're thrown into.
Wow, yeah. So, a lot of ways I could jump off. There's a lot to discuss with this brilliant book. So I think this isn't my observation, by the way, but I think it has been observed that your books do seem to enjoy an inciting incident, and in this case, as you mentioned, it's the storm and Doc's stroke. Would you agree with that you enjoy an inciting incident, and if so, or if not, what is the sort of backdrop that sits behind this book, the inciting incident of the inciting incident, as it were?
It's funny. I think I've often thought of myself as somebody who is not too concerned about plot, and I've sometimes struggled to describe my books because I feel as if nothing much is happening. But actually, that's not really true, and there is usually some kind of inciting incident, and maybe the inciting incident will occur quite a long way into the text, but there's always one kind of key moment that it hinges around. And I think that's to do, for me, it's to do with how I conceive of stories and how I kind of, I guess, stumble on an idea for a story that feels like it can fill a whole novel. And it's to do with, I guess, that kind of fascination with what would happen. Like, if something like that happened to you, what would it mean? You can pay a lot of attention to the moment itself, and often dramas and stories are focused on a dramatic moment. And I think I've always been much more curious about, well, how would that feel the next day? How would it feel a year later? How would that affect those people for the rest of their lives and the way they kind of process it? So I think, I think I have always been interested in inciting incidents in one way or another. But with this book, there was an inciting incident of the inciting incident, and the incitement to write this book for me was my trip to Antarctica in 2004. A series of failed attempts to write a novel with that as a starting point, kind of for all the 20 years since. So that was the beginning.
Wow. Why do you think those attempts failed? What was the failure?
It's really hard to write books. It's really hard to write novels. It's really hard to not get bored. And I have quite a sensitive antenna for getting bored by something I'm writing, and the awareness that, if I'm bored, then how on earth is a reader not going to be bored? And so I had lots of ideas coming out of that trip to Antarctica. I had lots of ideas about three men in a shed. That was always the kind of starting point, and that was one of the things that stuck. But I had lots of ideas about the kind of the boredom and the loneliness and the isolation of working in Antarctica, the kind of mundanity of it, the routine, the repetition, and the tensions that would arise between three men living in a shed for months on end. And I kept trying to write versions of this, and they all ended up being a bit boring. And not just boring, but kind of just in no way capturing what I wanted to capture about the experience of being in Antarctica, and the experience of the landscape, the experience of the place, the experience of the distance away from the rest of the world, the experience of it being this kind of, like, it's a place where humans don't belong. And I can't think of anywhere else in the world where humans belong less than Antarctica. People have only been able to be there because of developments in technology, developments in experience, developments in, I don't know, government institutions having the finance to put people there and keep them alive there. You shouldn't be there. There's nothing to keep humans alive in Antarctica. You have to take it all with you. And so I just couldn't capture that. I kept running out of words and giving up. I guess that was the problem.
And within all this, of course, it's worth mentioning, I think, that your trip to Antarctica wasn't as you had anticipated it would be. Is that fair to say? Maybe you could say a bit about that for us.
Yeah, it was a complete failure and a disappointment, which is kind of thematically, that's great, because the history of Antarctic exploration is one of failure and disappointment. So that kind of tied in quite nicely, but it still really sucked. So I was accepted onto this fellowship scheme British Antarctic Survey were running with the support of the Arts Council. They'd been running it for several years, I think, by the time I took up the offer. And literally, I just saw an advert in the jobs section in The Guardian, like writers and artists wanted to go to Antarctica. I was like, yep, that sounds great. I'll put my name down for that. And was awarded the place. And off I went. And you had to come up with a kind of scheme for what you wanted to do. And my scheme involved being a couple of fairly remote field stations on the Antarctic Peninsula itself, but traveling there by ship to kind of get the full range of experience. And so I got on the ship in the Falklands and headed off on what was supposed to be a 6-day trip to the Antarctic Peninsula. And 5 weeks later, the ship, it didn't get stuck in the ice, but it couldn't get through the ice. So they spent probably about a week and a half trying to get through some very unusually thick sea ice around the peninsula to the base. And they were disappointed as well, because they were taking a year's worth of supplies and 100-odd staff to the base. Nobody could get there. Everyone was disappointed. And my disappointment was kind of least of their concerns. But it was this weird experience of most of the time on the ship, we thought we were just about to get there. And we got to the point where we could see it on the horizon about 50 miles away. And then the captain just woke up one morning and just said, okay, well, we're at the point in our fuel where if we don't turn around now, we won't get back. So they turned around and came back to the Falklands, and it took a couple of days to get back, and then I was put on a plane and flown home. And so all of this build-up, all of this anticipation and excitement about getting to Antarctica was just kind of suddenly whisked away. So I was never really there. So it remains an imaginary space.
Goodness. Yeah, that must have been just so bitterly disappointing, not just obviously as an experience and everything, but also to what I imagine you had hoped to, in research terms, I suppose, or to your project, take away. I wonder how that effectively altered the course of how you were able to embark on this project then, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. And I think I was quite young at the time, relatively speaking, and had not really been on these kind of residencies and fellowships before that. And I think if I'd been more experienced, it would have occurred to me to be more flexible and just kind of get on with stuff. But because I had these plans for what I was going to do when we got there, I just sort of waited. And then suddenly I got home and I realised I'd just had 5 weeks on a ship and hadn't really done very much with it, apart from eat a lot of cheese. And that was really strange, and I kind of really regretted that I hadn't had the foresight to kind of make the most of my time on the ship, because that was a fascinating place to be in its own right. And I did have a lot of conversations with people, and not in a kind of overtly researchy way. I just naturally was talking to people and was able to kind of almost piece together kind of research by accident and stories that I'd heard, and got a real sense of other people's experience of Antarctica. But yeah, it was bitterly disappointing. And it was bitterly disappointing in a way that I could never really tell anyone about, because you can't go to Antarctica, be away for 6 weeks, and come home and say, oh, that was rubbish. It didn't work out. I'm really disappointed. So I had to kind of come back and tell everyone it was
quite
brilliant.
Quite a unique position to find yourself in. And I didn't realise, John, that had been the case. I read the novel and thought, and I'd been aware, I think, in reading around, that you'd had this trip. I didn't realise that the trip hadn't been fulfilled. So to my view then, it does seem like an extraordinary effort in terms of research. And I wonder if we could talk about that for a little bit, just how then you do build a world around this polar station and all of the work they do and the atmospheres and everything, having not been there. How did you embark on that then?
Yeah, I mean, I guess in exactly the same way as I would have done if I wanted to write a novel about Antarctica without going there in the first place, which was to read a lot of books and memoirs, look at a lot of websites, blogs, the social media accounts of people who have been working there, YouTube videos, and all the conversations I had on the ship. I was able to build up quite a detailed picture of, I guess, the kind of day-to-day kind of stuff of living and working in a place like that. What these field huts are like, what they have, what they don't have, some element of what the landscape is like and what the weather can be like, and the kind of experience of being out in that landscape can be like. And I think ultimately I made it up. It's a novel and I made it up. And I think so. One of the things I was wrestling with when I kept giving up writing it was that, having been to the places I got to, so having been on the ship, been in the ice, seen the icebergs, did get did get to South Georgia, which is technically a sub-Antarctic island, but is pretty close. Got to another island called Port Lockroy. Saw the penguins, saw the albatrosses. So had a kind of semi-detached experience of it. And the thing that really struck me was the first time we saw icebergs, and we were kind of going through a field of icebergs and getting a good close look at them. I realised that for all the pictures and films I've seen of icebergs, and particularly for all the kind of written descriptions I've read, none of that had ever actually captured what an iceberg is like. And seeing it in real life like that kind of really hit home how inadequate sometimes photographs can be, and certainly written descriptions can be. And so I tried to overcome that. I tried to write a better description of an iceberg and kind of failed miserably. And that was the thing that really got me thinking about how limited language can be. And I think the conclusion I kind of came to was that language mostly relies on shared experience. Like language is a shared tool. We have to share our understanding of language for it to function. And usually, like when I wrote Reservoir 13, which is set in Derbyshire, kind of out on the hills and moorlands, if I wanted to set a scene on the side of a moor, I only really had to say moor, and I would be really confident that most of the readers would understand, okay, heather, peat, sandy soil.
We've all got a go-to moor.
Yeah, exactly. We know what we're talking about, and I didn't have to go on for a couple of pages describing that. I could rely on the reader's shared understanding, which you can't do with Antarctica because it's just so completely other. And that was one of the things that really got me stuck.
Yeah, but then, so the other part of this, what this book explores, is another sort of an uncharted territory to very many of us, I think, is around aphasia and Doc's experience of aphasia following his stroke. So how then do you, well, I suppose, how did that sort of theme or context come into the writing of the book, and how did you begin to go about understanding that world?
I don't really remember how or why I decided to write about stroke and about aphasia in particular, other than a kind of passing curiosity developed into a bit of a kind of fascination, obsession, terror with the idea of just basically waking up one day and finding that you couldn't use language. And I think because I'd been doing all this thinking about why I was struggling to write about Antarctica, why language wasn't serving its purpose in that context, I kind of put the two things together, and my kind of terror of losing language, the experience I was already having of struggling to make proper use of language. But yeah, they were two very alien experiences. So I never actually got to Antarctica, but I was trying to write about it. I've never experienced aphasia, and at that point hadn't knowingly met anyone who had aphasia. And yeah, I wanted to write about that. And so it was, in terms of thinking about research and writing and to what extent you are just making it up, those were two really interesting areas. And I think I felt much more responsibility towards the experience of aphasia in terms of getting it right than I did about the experience of Antarctica, because to some extent Antarctica is an imaginary place. Obviously people have been there and experienced it, and it's a real experience, but it's also a kind of blank canvas. Whereas I didn't want to be glib and thoughtless and kind of completely speculative about the experience of stroke and of aphasia. So I ended up spending much more time researching that than Antarctica.
Yes, I suppose it takes a different sort of an ethical handling, doesn't it, with that sort of territory, so to speak. How then? So I think it's right to say you were then involved with a group of folks recovering from neural injuries. Tell us a little bit about that. That's sort of not method acting, method research, but very live study.
Yeah, as it were. So that was where that was the kind of the end point of my research. Really, was attending that group. Before that, I again did a lot of reading, a lot of kind of Googling, and yeah, it's amazing how much you can find out just by doing that to start off with. So I'm a kind of one of my kind of principles when I'm doing research is, if I'm going to take up somebody's time by asking them questions, I should have learnt the easy stuff first before I talk to them. So yeah, a lot of reading, just medical textbooks and again memoirs. But then got in touch with some people involved in speech and language therapy, some people involved in stroke, both from the kind of medical emergency side of things, but also from the kind of recovery and therapy side of things. Spent a day on the stroke ward with a speech and language therapist who was assessing people immediately after their stroke. But through all of that, didn't really spend much time talking to people who had experienced stroke or had aphasia or their families, and realised that that was the missing bit. So one of the therapists, speech and language therapists, put me in touch with this group. It turned out to meet just down the road from where I live. Essentially, it was like a monthly coffee morning for people with aphasia. And, once a month they would get together in this community centre and tea and coffee and biscuits. And one month it would be some singing. One month there would be bring a book in and talk about books. One month it was like talk about your holidays. One month they made a film. And it was just, and I went once. I thought I was going to go once and just kind of sit in the corner of the room and pretend I wasn't there and just watch. And I got there and they gave me a name badge, took £1 off me for biscuits and put me at the table, and I was just part of the group, which was great. And I felt really kind of welcome and included right from the outset, and ended up going for nearly a year, I think, until the lockdowns kicked in, and got to know people fairly well and kind of formed relationships with people. And the key thing I really discovered was, and I sort of knew this in theory, but it was brilliant to see it in reality. And it's the same with anything like this. But I've been reading about aphasia, and all these textbooks, and it was like there are 4 types of aphasia, and it gets quite complicated. But actually, there are as many types of aphasia as there are people with aphasia, because it affects everybody in different ways. And everybody in that room had different limitations to their language, different challenges, different ways in which they could understand what was going on or could express themselves, different levels of awareness about how clearly they were expressing themselves or not, and crucially different ways of kind of coping with it, kind of practically and emotionally, different ways of relating to their partner or with their partner. Some of the partners were maybe a bit too quick to kind of step in and speak for their loved ones. So it was amazing. And then the thing that really struck me was how much fun everyone was having in that room. There was a lot of laughter, a lot of silliness, a lot of teasing each other. And again, you kind of forget when you're researching any kind of particular area, you get so hung up on the kind of technicalities and practicalities, you forget that people are also just living their lives. And part of living your life is to have fun and be silly. And it was
absolutely
quite nice to see.
Yeah. Well, that I think leads us really nicely into some of the characters in the book, because obviously, I think that helps us understand how you got to the place where these were the things you wanted to explore. But within that, we've got Doc, as mentioned, and we've got his partner Anna, and wider family. So I wonder if you might want to, just when you were talking, I just wondered if Anna, for example, who, they've got I think they call it an anomalous setup, where Doc spends quite a lot of time away, and she's got very much her own career and so on. And then now they find themselves thrown back together in quite a different set of circumstances. Yeah, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and about Anna and how you build those characters.
Yeah, so she kind of crept up on me a bit when I was writing the book. I think so. Originally, the book was all going to be set in Antarctica. And then that didn't work. And so it was going to be Doc has his stroke, comes back to England. And I think, my original idea was a fairly simplistic and then is nursed back to health kind of thing, kind of recovery narrative. And within that narrative, I assumed he would have a wife, but hadn't really given any thought. So, I'll deal with her later. But then actually, you have to start thinking through who are these other people that you're going to be writing about. And I was thinking, okay, if he's been in Antarctica every year for 3 or 4 months, and meanwhile they've had children and she's had a career and has had to kind of look after the children all that time he's away, what's going on in that picture? How does that marriage work? Why has he never stopped going to Antarctica? Why has he kind of doggedly kind of pursued it? How do they relate to each other? Why has she not just ditched him? And began to kind of piece together this idea that actually it's the fact that he's absent for those long periods which is keeping their marriage together, and that actually there are quite big limitations in how they feel about each other, and it's but not. I sort of wanted that to just be okay. they're just different, and they're both happy with that, and that's all right. And she's got her own career and her own life and her own friendships and her own ways of bringing up the children, and it's okay. It's not a source of tension. It's just a different version of a marriage. And I got quite interested in that and thinking about who she might be as a result, and her kind of backstory and her history and her career as an environmental scientist, and her kind of concerns and anxieties around climate change. And then he comes kind of crashing back into the picture, and suddenly he is going to be there all the time. And not only there all the time, but utterly dependent on her. Mm-hmm. And that kind of brings everything kind of crashing down. And all that thinking, kind of trying to make sense of that story and make it work, really brought her to life for me. And I think in a lot of ways, she's the main character in the book.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's interesting. Yeah, she's a very, very, very interesting character, and I think for all the reasons described, but you kind of push her to the limits of her tolerance or what she feels capable of, or of what she wants to be doing. Would that be fair?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Yeah, and I think she doesn't really want to be caring for him. I mean, she wants him to be well, but she doesn't want to be the person who has sole responsibility and is trying to manage him and keep her job intact and cope with her adult children who are needy in various ways and kind of appearing and disappearing. She doesn't want that role. She doesn't want to be that person, but she hasn't got any choice. That's how being thrown into the role of a carer kind of works. You just have to get on with it, because you can't look any further than the end of the day. Just getting the person that you're responsible for to the end of the day, and then that's it.
I mean, I think that the book has quite a lot of interesting things to say about care and the role of the carer. And I think I'm right in saying it came out just while COVID was going on and all of that stuff. Did that have any impact on that desire to explore care and heroism of a kind, courage? Was that in there?
No, I don't think so. I mean, not COVID specifically, because I think I was in the very, very late stages of writing it by the time COVID happened. But I guess COVID kind of brought some of those ideas into focus for a lot of people. I think I was really interested. I've been really interested for quite a long time in care, the politics of care, and kind of the big P politics in terms of how care work is funded and supported and seen in this country, but also the small P politics of when it comes to informal care, i.e. unpaid care, like who ends up doing it, and why, and how that kind of informal care is supported or not supported, and how it's seen, and how often it's kind of framed as this kind of heroism. And sometimes, heroism is just used to kind of pat people on the head and just say, okay, carry on doing that without being paid or properly supported. Well done. And actually, a lot of people who are kind of end up in positions of being unpaid carers, it's not really heroism, because, as I was saying, there's not really any choice about it. You're just thrust into this situation, and you just have to do what you can. So I think just really interested in all of those things, and wanted to write about that. I think I was really keen to kind of show Anna as somebody who didn't feel heroic and wasn't being heroic, but nevertheless was just getting on with it.
Absolutely. I think that's interesting. You've outlined the things that you had identified as things you wanted to explore in the book, but I always wonder if there are things that sneak in that come unbidden, that you didn't think you wanted to explore, and then suddenly you find, there's a thread in there. Is that something that's the case for you, or with this book?
Yeah.
Or not? Maybe not at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's often the case, and I think with this book, pretty much everything I have just talked about for the last half an hour was unexpected. My original kind of vision for the book was three men in a shed dealing with their problems of masculinity and not much else. And then the idea of kind of striking Doc down and taking him elsewhere kind of crept in. And then, I had this idea that essentially it was going to be a recovery narrative, and actually doing lots of research, turns out that's often not how stroke works. And you kind of come out the other side of a stroke, and there are some ways in which some people can recover and improve their mobility and their speech and everything else, but sometimes there are ways in which that damage is just fixed, and that recovery is not necessarily the most helpful way to think about it. And so that kind of idea crept in, and the idea of coping with change and working around problems rather than just simply trying to solve them, that crept in, and the idea of care crept in. And I don't know, it's really complicated, isn't it? When you're writing a novel and you're spending maybe 2 or 3 years writing a novel, in this case, sort of 15 years writing a novel. Ideas creep in on the page, but also things are happening in your life that just creep in, and things are happening in the world that just creep in. And I think part of being a writer is being open to that and kind of chasing down those threads once they emerge.
Yeah. And I do realise I'm asking you questions about a book that was written over such a long period of time and casting your mind some way back. But I wonder when that, to you as the writer of the book, when that change comes and you realise, oh, gosh, I can't do the recovery narrative, or it has to take this other turn now. Does that feel disappointing, or is that epiphany? Or is it just probably different for each handbrake turn, I imagine?
I think I'm usually excited by those changes in emphasis, changes in direction. I mean, I think I knew right from the outset that the recovery narrative was not a great shape for a story, and not a great, it was kind of problematic in many ways. So I knew I was going to have to find some way of complicating that. I just didn't know what it was. But yeah, I think whenever you set out to write a story or a novel, I think I'm always aware that my first idea is probably too straightforward or too simple, and that it's going to get messier, and I quite enjoy being open to that.
Open to chaos.
Yeah, and just complication. I think the fiction I most enjoy reading is fiction where people are more complicated than you thought, and the stories are more complicated than you thought, and there's more nuance. That's because that's how life is. So that's what I want stories to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, here. Jon, I wanted to ask you a little bit about atmospheres generally, because it feels to me this is a book of obviously the sort of atmospheres in the weather, the basic way of weather, or the of location, which we've talked about already. But it feels like there's a sudden shift in atmosphere in this book, and I think I mean that obviously around what happens to Doc and then his change in circumstances. But and that it's in 3 parts. We're somewhere and then we're very suddenly somewhere very different. And I just wonder how much of a risk there is in that shift in atmospheres that you felt you might have been taking, or otherwise.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I never know if this makes me seem cocky, but I'm never really conscious of risk while I'm writing, and it's only sort of afterwards people say, "Oh, that seems like a risky thing to do." So, yeah, I don't know. I think I enjoy doing unexpected things with a story. I enjoy setting myself a challenge or putting myself in a corner and trying to kind of fight my way out of it. And I think, yeah, I mean, so I guess the key thing with this book is it opens in the storm. It opens at pace. It opens with a lot of drama and with a kind of a very kind of overtly page-turner-ish, cliffhanger-ish kind of feel, which was new for me and was a lot of fun to write. And I was kind of quite enjoying the idea that didn't feel like the sort of thing I would usually write. To the point of literally having somebody hanging from a cliff. I just thought I would go all in. But then I liked the idea that people would settle into that and think, okay, that's what this book is. And then to suddenly kind of pull that rug out from under them and say, no, actually, now we're in a hospital and now it's a completely different sort of narrative. And now the main character has changed and we're with Anna and we're thinking about completely different things. And I like that abrupt kind of, the screech of the brakes and the handbrake turn. And I think usually when I'm writing, if I like it, I'm going to do it. I don't really care. I'm not thinking. Sometimes you read this advice about, or think about your model reader, or think about your audience, or think about your reader's expectations, and I don't care, and I've never cared. And it's not like I think it's not. That's not a cockiness of, oh well, I've got my readers now, and I've got my career, and I'm all right, and I can do what I want. It's because I don't want to be that person, and I'm always really open to editors' feedback, and I want to edit my books a lot. But just that initial instinct of, and I know I've always had it since I first started writing, just I don't know who's going to read this, but I want to write it, and this is how I want to write it, and I really don't think I care if no one else likes it. Like that's my starting point, and just kind of piece together what comes next when it comes.
Oh, you've got to write the book that you've got to write, haven't you?
Yeah.
On the risk thing, I think I'd come to that because I read in an interview with you from some years ago that you'd said, and I quote, "I mean, everything about writing is a kind of risk, isn't it?" And I thought that was really interesting. I wonder if you've got any thoughts on that now through the rear view mirror of what you might have meant and whether it still feels that way.
I mean, I don't specifically remember saying that, but I'm sure I did. Yeah, everything about writing is a risk. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the risk is nobody reads it. The risk is people who read it don't understand it. The risk is you don't manage to achieve what you wanted to achieve, or you're misunderstood in some, or the story is misunderstood in and those are the risks. And I guess, I think I just kind of accept that as a starting point. And I think it comes back to this whole thing with communication and language and difficulties of language, and the kind of the way that language is never really quite good enough to really say what we're trying to say. And one of the reasons I got into writing when I did was because I was really conscious of how often I wasn't expressing myself in person very well, and wanted to kind of give myself the luxury of the time to consider my choice of words. But even then, language doesn't always do what we want it to do. That's what's exciting about it. And that's, when you read a great piece of work, you see somebody doing something new with language and something unexpected, but something which you nevertheless understand and get something from. And that, that's when the risk really pays off.
Yeah, and it feels in this book you are very much doing that, especially when it comes to Doc, just the very physicality of how you're writing about his grappling with language. I thought that was really interesting, and I wondered if you wanted to say anything to that, just on that note around the physicality of it all.
Yeah. Well, it was really interesting with Doc's language and with thinking about aphasia and the different kind of manifestations of aphasia for people. And, I sort of got to a point where I was kind of detached from the emotional impact of it and was just thinking about it on a technical level and thinking about, in a very kind of linguistic sense, how language functions and what people were doing with their language and how they were, where the gaps were and the kind of blockages and the misunderstandings. And the overlap of kind of trying to think about that and trying to write examples of that. There was an overlap between that and kind of writing poetry and writing, particularly writing poetry that is concerned with constraints and rules and the kind of Oulipo thing. And I guess kind of concrete poetry and that kind of stuff. And I just kind of clicked into a point where I just had a lot of fun with it. And it became this kind of technical puzzle of if somebody's only got access to half a dozen words, how much complexity can they get into those half a dozen words? How does tone of voice contribute to their meaning, and how are you going to get tone of voice onto the page? And it was it was just kind of, I kind of left aside the kind of emotion of it and just wrestled with the kind of practicalities and had a lot of fun in the process.
That was a question I had, actually, coming off an event we had very recently here at Dragon Hall between Claire Pollard and Ferdia Lennon, in which I think it was Ferdia, they were asked, is writing like playing for you? And I don't imagine it always is, but it sounds like it sometimes is for you.
Yeah. Oh, definitely. And in all sorts of ways. And one of the ways for me is to give myself lots of rules and structures and kind of constraints to work within and against, and to turn it into a process of problem solving. I think that's generally been the only way I've been able to build momentum in writing, because writing a novel is all about some level of momentum and making progress. And it's like I'm kind of creating a game for myself and a puzzle for myself to solve. and it is fun. And some of the it was always kind of interesting when I wrote years ago now, when I wrote a book called Even the Dogs, which is about homelessness and drug addiction and alcohol addiction and the Afghanistan war, and is kind of a bleak and gruesome book in lots of ways, and I imagine quite a hard read. I had a lot of fun writing that book, and which I always have to be careful about telling people. But again, it was this thing of like I did the research, I got my head around the experiences I wanted to write about, and then I was just playing with storytelling. I was playing with language, playing with the shapes of dialogue and the shapes of stories, and yeah, it was a sort of play, and it was kind of fun. Which is kind of a weird thing to say.
No, I don't think it is. I mean, I think it is interesting to hear you reflect back on an older work, and I wondered at that. I recently reread If Nobody Speaks of Remarkable Things, which is a book I really, really love, and it landed differently for me as a reader because I live in a terraced house, and it felt a different, experientially quite different. And I just wondered if that is the case for you in general, that your books, even this book, which, as we say, came out a couple of years ago now, does it land differently now? Coming back to it, do any of them?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's a really odd and interesting experience looking back at previous work, and this Lean Full Stand already feels like previous work, and Lean Full Stand in particular, it came out in 2021 in the kind of turned out to be the second year of the lockdown, and did very, very few events for it, and most of those were online. And that was a different experience from publishing my previous books, when I've done lots of events and talked to lots of readers about those books. This book just sort of felt like it snuck out the back door, and as a result, it's always felt slightly less real for me, which is quite strange. And also because it was written over such a long, most of it was written in 2 or 3 years, but the kind of ideas and sketches that kind of went into it went back 15, 16 years. But other books, yeah, I think it's really interesting looking back at previous work, because they're inevitably a product of who you were at that time. And especially, If Nobody Speaks, it came out when I was 26. I wrote most of it when I was 24. It was kind of a compilation of all the writing I'd ever done up to that point. So there's stuff in there that I'd written when I was, I guess, 19, 20, 21. So it feels like the work of a very different version of me. And I did an event last year in Bradford with Andrew McMillan, kind of marking the 21st anniversary of the book coming out. And obviously that was the first time in years that I'd talked about it in public or read from it in public. And yeah, it was interesting. It's a book I have really mixed feelings about, but it's a product of a different me.
Goodness. That's a whole other podcast, making writers revisit their earlier works and looking at them. A lot of the people that will hopefully be listening to this podcast are themselves writers at various stages of their careers. And I wonder if you have then any advice for someone who might be in a project that's not quite gone, the way it was planned to, or hit a global pandemic. Hopefully that won't happen again. But what advice would you give to a writer with a longer project that might need a bit of tenacity or endurance?
When you could do what I did and put it to one side and write a different book instead, which I must have done at least 3 times. Yeah, I don't know. I mean that turned out to be the right thing for me at the time. It turned out I wasn't ready to write that book. I hadn't done enough thinking, or the right type of thinking, or I didn't have the right direction for it to go in. And it comes back to what I was saying at the beginning. If I'm bored, then I can be pretty sure the reader's going to be bored. What a great thought from George Saunders years ago, when he said it's quite easy to kind of idolize his writing process, but he talked about in his writing shed always having 3 or 4 stories on the desk at any one time. And when he goes in the morning, he looks at each of them and he says, because he always anthropomorphizes his stories. And he says, so he's a little chat with them and says, which one of you is going to get my attention today? That was the George Saunders accent. But he just picks the one that kind of jumps out at him. And I've always really liked that idea. And I think there's something to be said for doing the work that gets your attention rather than kind of plodding through something because you feel like you're supposed to. So that I think that'd be the main thing. Like if it's not working for you at the moment, then do something else. On the other hand, if it's half working for you but you're not quite sure where to go with it, then read more, write more, go for a walk, read back over what you've written, start making. Like sometimes it can be good to not write, but just to kind of make notes and sketch ideas and give yourself little exercises like interviewing your characters or describing a setting in much more detail than is going to end up in the actual book. Yeah, those are two interesting ones that
Good
sometimes
tips.
work. But yeah, just stay at the desk, but do something else. In summary.
Lovely. I mean, yes. Thank you, Jon. Thank you, George. I mean, that does lead me to my final question, which is, what is getting your attention at the minute? What are you working on? What's exciting? Can you say?
Yeah, I've got at least 3, probably 4 projects on the go on my desk at the moment, which is probably too many, but I'm quite enjoying. I've been on research leave from my teaching post this year, so I'm enjoying having too much writing to do. The one I'm doing at this very moment is a series of stories for Radio 4, all based on still the idea of a still life. I'm trying to write something that is as static as possible and has as little drama and tension as possible, but is still very compelling to listen to. That was my pitch, and it was a bit of a wrestle. Yeah, that's what I'm working on. I love writing for radio, and I haven't done very much of it because it's such a different. I said earlier that I don't care what the reader thinks, and obviously most of what I say isn't true. So when you're writing for the radio, you're very aware of a listener instead of a reader, and what a reader can do is look back up the page and slow down or pause or double check something. And a listener can't do any of those things. And so you have to make sure that everything hits and that they can keep up. And it's really, we talked about game playing, and that's a fun challenge to try and solve.
Goodness, yes, there, as we know from the NCW podcast, they're a discerning bunch, listeners. So let's look forward to that. Sounds absolutely brilliant, and we'll look forward to that, Jon. Do you know when that will drop? Is it a while off?
September. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, things happen quickly in the world of radio.
Well, indeed. All right. Well, I think that's a great place to finish, having looked back at the past a little bit and looking forward to what's coming. So cool. Thank you so much. That's been a real pleasure.
A big thank you to Jon McGregor and Peggy for their time. We love you both. If you have any questions or you want to get in touch, you can find us at Writers Centre on Twitter and Instagram. We're on Facebook. And don't forget to sign up to the NCW newsletter at nationalcentreforwriting.org.uk. As a UK registered charity, we rely on the generosity of our supporters to make our work possible. You can make a donation over on the website today by clicking on the Support Us button. And if you enjoyed what you heard today, please do consider subscribing to the podcast and leaving a 5-star rating and a review, because it really does help other people to find us. Thanks again, keep writing, and I'll catch you on the next episode.